Hello, welcome to our Psychotherapy Foundation and Formulation Introduction. We've developed this in response to not being able to offer face-to-face sessions during the coronavirus epidemic. Normally, these sessions would be offered in a group format, but we thought it would be useful to share some ways of understanding the experiences that have led to your referral to the psychotherapy service. When you've completed this, we hope you'll be better able to understand perhaps what's underlying some of the issues you're seeking help with and what you would need to focus on in any further ongoing psychotherapy work. We're going to be covering a series of topics that we hope are going to be relevant to you. We hope that these topics are going to help you better make sense of yourself in terms of thoughts, feelings and relationships and how these all interact with each other. We also hope that you'll be better able to understand what's led to your symptoms and what provides resilience for us and supports our mental well-being. In particular, we're going to be covering something called mentalising, which we will cover in these next few slides. And by the end of this, we hope that you'll be able to develop your goals, be clearer about what your goals are, and how you'd like to change things in your life going forward. The sessions are split into 4. The first one we're going to talk about is what is this thing called mentalising and how this might be relevant to our mental well-being and managing depression, anxiety and trauma symptoms. The second session, we're going to be thinking about emotions. Why do we have emotions? What's the purpose of them? What are the different kinds of emotions and how do we recognize them both in ourselves and others? And also starting to think about when emotions become problematic for us, when they become something that we might refer to as distress, and how we can better manage that. The third session is going to be about something called attachment. There's been lots of research about this, and this really refers to the kind of emotional bonds we form with each other and how secure or not we feel within those. We think this is very relevant to our mental well-being. And then the final session, we're going to start thinking about the sort of roles and patterns, familiar roles and patterns that we all find ourselves within in our interpersonal relationships, and thinking about how these patterns contribute to our mental well-being. And having completed all of these sessions, we're going to invite you to reflect on what you've learned and how that might have influenced what you feel your goals might be going forward. So we're now going to start to focus on this thing called mentalising. It's not the most user-friendly term, but I hope by the end of this session you'll know what we mean by it. And hopefully you'll see how important it is as a universal skill or capacity in all of us, how central that is to enabling us to negotiate our social world and develop fulfilling and meaningful relationships. Okay, so by way of getting us into thinking about what this thing called mentalising is, I just want to invite you to reflect for a few moments on this question. So, in order to successfully negotiate my social world and to have effective and fulfilling relationships, if we were to try to break it down, what might I need to be able to do relatively well in order to achieve those things. These are some of the things that when we've asked this question to other groups that have come up. So people have identified how it's important for us to be able to listen, and when we've discussed this and expanded that, people have thought that actually it's quite complicated when we start to listen to each other. We start to recognize that maybe we're not saying everything that's on our minds, so we have to listen quite carefully. We've got to be able to communicate well, so we've got to be able to put into words our own experiences, our own wishes, our own needs. We've got to be able to, back to the sort of listening question, we've got to be able to read body language. Sometimes that gives us an indication of how someone's feeling, how they are receiving what we're saying to them. We've also got to have some sense of what's going on inside ourselves. How are we experiencing any kind of interaction that we might be having? How are we feeling generally? How is that going to influence how we communicate with each other? We've also got to be able to read other people's emotions. That involves being able to empathize, being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, try to see it from their perspective. So all of these things make a pretty good start at identifying what this thing called mentalizing is, which we'll go on to define more clearly in the next slides. As I've already implied, mentalizing is very much a skill. So it's an ability or capability that's a universal skill that we all have, but that we all lose from time to time, particularly when we're under stress. But it's that skill to be able to make sense of our behaviour, our own behaviour and that of other people we're interacting with or we're involved with. And it's that ability to understand what tends to drive our behaviour. So we're all motivated by our own wishes, desires, our beliefs, our values, our emotions. These are all the things that drive our behaviour. And mentalizing is this ability to read that in each other and in ourselves. So when you're thinking about what you're feeling, or you're wondering what someone else might be thinking or feeling in any situation, that's a sign that you're mentalizing. You're wondering about what's in your mind, and you're wondering about what's in the mind of other people. When we're not mentalizing, we tend not to pause and check in and make sense of what's going on for ourselves or what might be going on for other people. So when we're acting immediately on quick assumptions, that might be a sign that we're not mentalizing very well. So this skill is, we think, really important in terms of our mental well-being. I'll give you a short example really of what mentalizing entails and how we're prone to error sometimes. So there was someone who happened to be a medical doctor. So she was a GP, and she had a 2-year-old toddler, a daughter, and she was watching her daughter playing on one occasion, and her daughter had gone into her bag and taken out her stethoscope. which is that piece of apparatus that doctors use to listen to someone's chest. And as her daughter was playing with this and putting the bit that you listen to in her ears, she started to think, oh, I know what's going on here. I think my daughter is very much wants to be a doctor like me. As she was playing with this stethoscope, she was imagining that the daughter was wanting to become a doctor like her when she was older. A reasonable assumption to make, one might think. But she was jolted out of this reading of what was going on for her daughter in that moment, when the daughter suddenly put the piece of the stethoscope that you would put on someone's chest to listen to their breathing or the heartbeat. She put that part to her mouth and said, "Hello everybody, good afternoon, welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order, please?" I thought that was a very good example of how, we're all the time interpreting each other's behaviour, trying to make sense of what's going on, but how easy it is for us to make reasonable assumptions but then perhaps get it wrong. And these misunderstandings are a part of everyday life. But when we're not mentalising well, it can have an impact on our relationships if we're sort of operating with each other in a way that we're making assumptions that might not be accurate. One of the things that we think mentalising is really important for is that we think it helps us to manage and regulate our feelings and emotions. Because it's when we're able to understand those inner experiences and responses to things and put them in a context to make sense of them, when we're able to understand why we might be feeling something in any particular situation, and when we're able to make sense and better understand why other people may be responding to us in the way that they are, that helps us to make sense of our emotions, and that's what helps us to regulate them and manage them. Emotions tend to get out of control when we can't make sense of why they are there. Why are we feeling these things? It's also important to emphasize with you that we all struggle to mentalize at times, particularly when we are stressed. So it's normal to go through periods when we are able to mentalize and reflect quite well, and periods when we find that much more difficult. We'll go on to expand on that as the sessions progress. One of the definitions of mentalizing that I really like is where seeing it as being able to see ourselves from the outside as other people see us, but also seeing others from the inside. So that's the empathy bit of it, of being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and see it from their perspective. But that's only half of it. As I was saying earlier, it's being able to have a sense of how other people are experiencing us, but also knowing our own inner subjective experiences. It's also a really important skill that allows us to start to work through when we misunderstand each other. Someone was telling me, and I don't know how this has been measured, but in any stable relationship, be it an intimate relationship or a family relationship or a friendship, we tend to feel properly understood by each other only about 40% of the time. So much of the time we're misunderstanding each other, but in our stable relationships, we're able to work that out together. We're able to sort of talk it through, make sense of the misunderstanding. And so we think mentalizing is the thing that facilitates that and enables that. So it's a really important skill that builds resilience in us. It's also about something that helps us to put our experiences in a context that enables us to reflect on the past, to be able to stop and check in with what we're experiencing in the present. And it's also a skill that enables us to look into the future and predict how we might experience certain situations or events or consequences. So just to summarize, mentalizing helps us to understand ourselves, who we are, what our preferences might be, what our values are. So it helps us when we're developing our sense of identity about who we are. It also helps us to understand what's taking place between people, trying to make sense of that. It helps us to communicate well with our close friends, family, work colleagues. It helps us to regulate our own feelings when we can make sense of why we might be experiencing things the way we are. It also helps us to regulate the feelings of other people we're involved with, if we're able to put ourselves in their shoes and demonstrate that we understand what it's like for them. That often helps them to feel more calm and settled. It helps us, as I was saying earlier, work through misunderstandings, which are an inevitable part of our experience. And it helps us see the connection between emotions and actions more easily. And when we're able to do that, we might be able to better avoid destructive patterns of thoughts and feelings more easily. Many of the people that we see in our service report to us that they spend too much time thinking about what might be going on for other people, what they're feeling and thinking, that they feel they overthink and overanalyze about those things. And indeed, that is a very common phenomenon, that we can start to worry about how we've affected other people. We start to worry about how we're seen by other people, and we can get caught up in a rather unproductive, unhelpful, going round in circles, wondering about, well, maybe they meant this when they said that. Maybe they felt rejected by me when I said I just wanted to put my head under the duvet. Maybe we felt rejected by them when they said something similar to us. We start to overthink. This is something that we have termed hyper-mentalising, when we're spending too much time poring over, wondering about what's gone on for someone. In a sense, this is a consequence, really, that our states of mind are essentially private. We can't know what's in each other's minds. There's not a window into each other's minds that we can look through and know what's going on for people. And that's why mentalizing becomes quite a difficult task. We can infer or make a good guess about what's going on for people, and we're better able to do that when we know people well, when we know what their values might be, what their beliefs in the world might be, what's important to them. But essentially we can only really know by checking out with people. In order to develop our understanding of what this thing called mentalizing is, I think it can be helpful to break it down into these 4 poles or dimensions of mentalizing. Think of these as a continuum where at one end is a particular focus and at the other end is the opposite focus. So to take the bottom one here on the slide, we can be very self-focused in our mentalizing, focused in on our own experiences. Or at the other end of the continuum, we can be much more focused on other people and what's going on for them, what's in their minds. And some of us in our personalities can be, have more of a bias to one of these than others. For instance, people who are particularly find themselves in caring roles or looking after others or always trying to please other people may be very good at thinking about what's going on for other people, might be less comfortable with reflecting on what's going on for ourselves. So that's that pole between self and other is an important one that's helpful for us to think about where we're mentalizing. The next one up from the bottom is thoughts, or what we sometimes call something called cognitions at one end of a continuum, and our emotions at the other. And some of us again can be in our personalities more weighted or biased in which of these ways of seeing the world takes preference in helping us to understand what's going on. Some of us might be very influenced by our emotions in a situation and use that as a way of informing us as to what's going on. So we might be feeling sad in a situation, and we might be using that feeling of sadness then might be the thing that we use to tell us what's going on, that we might feel, I must be feeling hurt if I'm feeling sad. Whereas some of us might be much more weighted towards rational things as to informing us about what's happening. One good way of understanding this dimension is to think about a scenario where perhaps someone's trying to sell us something, and they might be, in our thoughts and rational mind, they might be making a good case to us that whatever it is that they're trying to sell us is something that we need, and that might be influencing us to want to buy the thing. Whereas deep down in our emotions, we might be feeling, I'm not sure I quite trust this. It all seems too good to be true. And so we might then use our emotions to influence how we read that situation. The next pole or dimension is the one where we might have more of a exterior focus, and by that we might be influenced much more by someone's facial expression or their role or their body language, and use that as the primary source of information that's going to inform us about what's in their mind at any time. And at the other end of that spectrum, some of us might be much more interiorly focused, much more thinking about someone's inner world and their values as what might be informing us about how they might be experiencing a situation. And then the top one, we can be quite immediate and spontaneous in making our minds up about what's happening in any interaction. And much of us are doing that in that spontaneous and natural way all of the time when we're interacting with each other. We don't need to exert ourselves and do not even notice that we're mentalizing or that we're interpreting each other's intentions and feelings. We simply respond to each other reciprocally by making reasonable assumptions about each other's motives. It's only when things depart from this expected response that we might become surprised, and then we might have to be shifted towards being much more sort of controlled or deliberate in our mentalizing, where we pause and think, gosh, what happened just then? Did he really understand what I meant? I don't think he's quite received what I meant to say. Let me try one more time. Or, oh my God, the same thing's happened again. They just won't listen to me. Fine if they want to be like that. I've had enough of trying to explain things to them. So we then need to resort to that more controlled mentalizing to work out what's happened. Now with this, there's no right or wrong pole to be operating in. But generally, for us to function well in life, we need to be able to flexibly move across these poles. There are times when we might need to be making our minds up quickly, particularly if we're faced with a threat. If we think that someone's behaving in a quite suspicious and threatening way, we need to make our minds up quickly about keeping ourselves safe. So that might need an automatic response. Whereas there's other times when perhaps misunderstandings have happened in a significant relationship, where we need to stop and pause and reflect on what's happened and make sense of it and be much more controlled and deliberate about things. So, as I was saying, there's no right or wrong here, but what we think will help us function better in life is to flexibly move between these poles as needed in whatever situation we're facing. So given, as we've already said, that misunderstanding is part of everyday life and that we're constantly having to respond to each other and clarify with each other what we meant and work things through, why do we misunderstand? Why are we so prone to misunderstanding each other? And these misunderstandings are often a consequence of us losing our mentalizing. So one of the things I've already emphasized is we can't read each other's minds. Often we think we can. So we might say, for instance, I go to visit a friend. They answer the door. They don't smile. I notice that they don't smile at me. And I start to think, okay, I knew they never really liked me. I knew they didn't want to really meet with me today. They didn't smile at me. That would be an example, by the way, of me being very mentally exterior focus, of just making my mind up about what's going on, just based on someone's body language and their facial expression. But it's also an example of me trying to read someone else's mind and be absolutely certain about what's going on. And in that respect, certainty, when we say things with absolute certainty, that might be a sign that we've maybe not mentalizing very well. Is when we're able to hold on to a degree of doubt is an indicator that we may be mentalizing better. So just to go back to this question of why do we so often misunderstand each other, we can attribute thoughts to other people and can think that others are thinking the same way that we are. We can assume others know what's going on in our minds without really properly verbally communicating it. And it can be difficult to express and put into words our inner thoughts and feelings. That's why we've got hundreds of years of arts and literature. All of these are attempts to describe the human condition that can be very confusing and bewildering at times. And we tend to have different ways of interpreting the same situation. And the other key thing that we want to emphasize with you is that the mind has many layers, and we may not have full access to all of those layers, even in ourselves. I'm going to go on to explain this. We call it the 90-10 principle. So just to develop this idea of the 90-10 principle, it is looking at our mind as an iceberg, as it were. The conscious bit of our mind is probably just the tip of the iceberg that's showing on the surface, and that's the bit we can see. But underneath the water, there's the main body of our minds, which is made up of all sorts of aspects and experiences that might be subconscious, that might not be conscious to us at all. This is made up of past experiences and things that we can't describe to ourselves. So that's this sense then of these layers of our mind that are under the surface and not even available to us. So our conscious mind is made up of our willpower, our memories, things in our long-term memory, our rational, logical mind, our critical thinking. Those make up all parts of our conscious mind and experiences. Whereas underneath, often, are our beliefs and values. We're not always thinking about them. They're influencing us a lot of the time, but we're not always conscious of them. And we're not always conscious of the different emotions that we might have. And we'll come and develop that one in the next session, in session 2, when we focus in on emotions. But usually, when you start to unpick our emotional response to a situation, there's usually like a surface emotional response, but underlying that there might be other more hidden emotions that are influencing us. And there's things in our intuition, our imagination. This all makes up this submerged part of the iceberg of our subconscious mind. You may be wondering, what's all of this talk of mentalizing got to do with my depression? Well, we think that the symptoms of depression are very much a consequence of a loss or impairment in our ability to mentalize. In this respect, when we're depressed, we want to isolate ourselves. We kind of turn inwards and we lose curiosity with both trying to understand what underlies our own experiences and that of other people that we may be involved with. And so we become caught up with rather rigid, inflexible ways of seeing ourselves and losing our curiosity about maintaining contact with other people. So an example of that sort of rigid feeling is we tend to get very absolute and rather self-damning in our depressive thought processes. I'm such a useless failure. It's no surprise no one wants to spend any time with me. that's an example. It's rather absolute. It's rather uh, um, generalized, and it's globally dismissing myself as having any value. That's an indicator that mentalizing has been lost. And so we think that recovering our mentalizing is an important part of recovering from depression. And whilst it's understandable how much we want to isolate and withdraw when we're in the grips of that, we know that the one thing that helps people to emerge from depression is trying to fight that urge and trying to maintain some contact with our social network. And it's that I think facilitates our and recovers our mentalizing, because we're needing our mentalizing when we're interacting with each other. So we're going to think now a little bit about anxiety. Anxiety is actually a natural response in us. It's very much linked to one of the basic emotions that we call fear. This can be an appropriate and necessary response when we're facing some kind of danger. So it is actually something that's potentially useful to us, but it becomes problematic when it gets out of balance, when we lose our ability to judge whether what we are facing is a significant threat or not. In thinking of the example we're all caught in at the moment as a society with coronavirus, this has very much been an unknown threat to us. So it's difficult for us to then judge how anxious we need to be or not. But some of us, when anxiety really gets hold of us, it can really restrict our lives, so that we find ourselves unable to go outside, unable to face any social situation. In those instances, it's got out of balance for us, and we've lost our capacity to judge what we need to be wary of and alarmed in relation to, and when we don't need to be so concerned. And in that sense, we can understand anxiety and anxiety problems and anxiety disorders as being linked to a loss of mentalizing, in that sense that when we're caught up by that experience of anxiety, we're not able to reflect and make a considered judgment about what we're facing. So just thinking now about the relationship between mentalizing and trauma, we can understand trauma symptoms when we have flashbacks to really distressing events and things that have happened to us, and we find ourselves easily triggered into reliving those awful things that might have happened, or we're looking out for signs of further threat in a constant way. We can understand those symptoms developing when there's been the absence of other people around us to share that experience, whatever it was, whatever the bad experience it might be, or experiences that have happened to us. It's being able to share those experiences with others that helps us to mentalize them. So in this sense, having an experience of bad things happening to us doesn't in itself necessarily mean that we're going to develop trauma symptoms or have a trauma response that stays with us. Lots of studies have shown that being able to share the impact of bad experiences on ourselves and how they've affected how we are in ourselves, being able to share that with someone else, another mind that's receptive and interested in understanding what's happened to us, that experience buffers us against trauma symptoms developing. So in a sense, being able to share your experiences is what helps us to mentalize them, or we could also sort of call it, that helps us sort of digest and process bad and difficult things that have happened to us. And that availability of being able to share that experience helps us maintain mentalizing. It helps us to still reflect on what's happened. And so the memories of what's happened to us are able to be sort of kept in a moderated way so that they don't become so toxic. When we've not had an opportunity to share the bad experiences, that's when trauma symptoms can develop and overwhelm us. And in that sense, we can understand trauma symptoms as being a kind of marker, as it were, that we lost our capacity to mentalize in the face of really bad, difficult, troubling things happening to us. So far in this module, we've talked about this skill to be able to reflect on what drives our behaviour and how important this is in us making sense of our interactions with each other and building some resilience into helping us work through the inevitable misunderstandings that happen when we do interact together. And we've thought a little bit about how this relates to some of the common symptoms of depression, anxiety, trauma, and how those things can all be understood in terms of a temporary breakdown in this skill to reflect and mentalize about our emotions and our inner experiences and those of the people we are involved with. So we just want to invite you now to just consider this scenario, really, and to think about, how you might interpret what's happened here. What do you think might be behind the fictional character's behaviour in this scenario? So the scenario is that it's Michelle's birthday. He's planning to celebrate with Lila, his girlfriend, and has invited her around for dinner. He's bought some wine to go with the food and is very much looking forward to Lila coming this evening after an important meeting. When she arrives, she doesn't have a gift with her, and she says to Michelle, "Wow, what a dinner you've made, and on a Tuesday." As the meal progresses, Michelle becomes quite quiet and drinks most of the wine himself. So just spend a few moments to yourself reflecting on how you might make sense of what's happened in this scenario. So these are some of the themes that have come up when we've shared this scenario with other groups. Mostly people have some sense that Michelle is upset that Lila seems to have forgotten his birthday. But different people emphasise different emotions that he might be struggling with that. Some people have emphasised how hurt he might be feeling, how sad he might be feeling. Others have emphasised how angry he might be feeling in this scenario. Mostly people wonder about him drinking most of the wine and wonder about whether he's trying to dampen these feelings by drinking the wine through the meal. We've given you a very scant information really for this scenario, so there's lots of unknowns here. But there's a question about, well, did he actually let Lila know that it was his birthday? Regardless of that, there seems to be a question as to why he didn't say anything during the meal when she didn't seem to acknowledge that it was his birthday. Why might he not feel able or might not want to raise that? And people often have a sense that maybe it's a bit embarrassing, or we might feel a bit ashamed of revealing some wish to be made to feel special on his birthday. So when we start to think about a sort of everyday scenario like this, the situation becomes really quite complex and complicated. This exercise demonstrates often when we do this in groups is that people can interpret the same event in quite different ways. As I was saying before, the different people identify different feelings in the different characters here. And these perspectives are often based on our own experiences. Also, I've already talked about how our states of mind are essentially private, that we can't know for sure what's on someone's mind. We can assume or guess based on external cues, the context of things, what we might know about each other. But essentially, we can only truly know by checking out with each other. And then the other thing that we like to draw out from doing this exercise is that some of our thoughts about the situation might be more focused on what's in each other's minds, what the different characters might be experiencing in terms of their feelings, the thoughts they might be having. Whereas other perspectives might not be so focused on the mind. So in the example, if we start to think about Michelle and having a sense that he might be feeling quite upset that his birthday has been overlooked, that's an example where we're trying to get underneath the surface of things and understand what's in someone's experience. Whereas if we're saying, well, I just think he must just like wine because he's drunk it all, we're perhaps not trying to get under the surface of things. And that's really what we're kind of promoting with you in this first module, which I'll come on to talk about in the next slide. But we're really inviting you to be curious about what your experiences are, and more curious about what might be going on under the surface for other people that we're involved with. So what we're advocating with you, what we're encouraging you to do, is to try to take what we call a mentalising stance in your everyday life. So that's really about trying to keep a curiosity about your own inner experiences and a curiosity about what might be going on inside other people that we're involved with or that we're having conversations with. A curiosity about those things that really influence our behaviour, our thoughts, our feelings and emotions, our values and beliefs. So try to keep that curiosity and maybe practice that. You might be having coffee with someone, or you might be having a FaceTime conversation or a telephone conversation with someone, and just practice perhaps being curious with other people, being curious about how you're experiencing the conversation, and curious about what the other people might be describing. And what's really key in this is to try to be non-judgmental about any of it. Our curiosity often gets shut down when we make critical judgments about things, whether it's ourselves, or, it's really weak of me to be feeling upset and sad in this situation. So we close it down, we judge it, we criticize it, and then that leaves us kind of unable to really explore why am I feeling upset and sad in this situation? So it's trying to be non-judgmental and compassionate, actually, with ourselves and other people. So do try and practice that, and we'll come on to the next module where we start to focus in about emotions particularly and what's the purpose of them.